So now that most of us are here, I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's session, an introduction to 360 feedback and individual feedback tools. A few house rules before we start. Can everyone keep themselves muted for the duration of the webinar and your videos turned off? We will be recording this session and the slides will be distributed to all attendees at the end. So I'm delighted to welcome Jon Stokes. He's a Meyler Campbell faculty member, director of the leadership and management development firm Stokes & Jolly, founder of the consulting service at the famous Tavistock Clinic, where he's also a clinical psychologist, and an associate fellow at Oxford University Said Business School. He has worked as a leadership advisor, business psychologist, and coach to many different types of organizations, and in recent years, particularly professional service firms in the law, accountancy, financial services, and advertising. Okay, finally, there will be a short 5-minute break during the webinar, as well as 2 opportunities for Q&A. So that's enough from me. Over to you, Jon.
Thanks very much, Alana, and welcome everyone to this webinar, Introduction to 360-Degree Feedback. As Alana says, there'll be an opportunity for Q&A halfway through and towards the end. So I'm going to take you through these slides, and my aim is obviously to introduce you to 360 feedback in various formats. The central thesis or reason for doing 360 feedback is this statement: you are not who you think you are who we think you are. This is really trying to capture the fact that in actual fact, your conception of who you are is not necessarily the same, as your experience in life has probably told you, as how other people experience you. Another way of putting this is to say that you are the impact you have on others. Now that might sound like just a buzz phrase, but it's essentially saying, scientifically speaking, you are the impact you have on another person. We know people's brains mirror each other's, and that is the way in which we communicate, and therefore the impact you have on somebody else, that's who you are. And the reason for feedback is to find out who you are, at least according to another person. This is the agenda I'm going to take you through. Why do feedback in the first place, and what is 360 feedback? And then I'll take you through an interview method for collecting 360 that you can use yourselves, and how to do that. Then we'll have a brief Q&A session, and then a short break at around 1 o'clock. And in the second half, I'll be introducing you to a couple of tools that I've designed: Stokes & Jolly Leadership and Management 360 instrument, and the Stokes & Jolly At My Best feedback instrument. Look at the pros and cons of the different methods I've introduced you to, and then how, if you wish, you can get qualified to use the 2 Stokes & Jolly instruments. And finally, we'll end up with a Q&A session and some discussion, which Alana will manage. So here we go. Some common reasons why people's careers derail, as it's called. As you see here, are experience that the person is rigid, they make poor relationships, they are poor at self-control, conscientiousness, trustworthiness, social skills, and building their relationships. This is some research done by the Centre for Creative Leadership on how leaders and senior managers commonly derail in their careers, because they haven't, generally speaking, have had constructive, at least, feedback about their behavior. There are 2 fundamental issues, I'm saying, about 360 feedback and why getting feedback is important. The first is that generally our self-awareness is not 100%, as I've explained. You are the impact you have on others, and how could you know that unless you find out? And as people get more senior, the quality and quantity of the feedback they get tends to diminish. And for various reasons, people are reticent to do so, or it's not in their interests to do so sometimes, because they may be competitors, for example. And the second fundamental issue is that of human tendency to want to deny and avoid painful experiences. So we tend to avoid what we perhaps know. Many of the times, in my experience, I've been doing this for 25 years, people's feedback isn't a total surprise to them, but what hasn't happened is they haven't taken account of it, really. It's been pushed to the side of their conscious mind, and they haven't attended to this fact, because essentially it's painful. It makes you feel awkward to realize you're not who you think you are. Indeed, we know this from, if you've ever watched yourself on a video, indeed you can't really escape that these days, you'll realize you're not exactly who you thought you were there either. So this is to point to the fact that humans tend to be rather self-centered in the way they view themselves, and feedback is really a skill for life. Many of you, those of you who've been on the Meyler Campbell program, will know of the Johari window, so called because two psychologists who are called Joe and Harry dreamt up this 2x2 matrix, which on the left-hand vertical column, it says self-disclosure. In other words, in order to give people feedback about yourself, you need to disclose things about yourself. And along the top horizontal axis, the top of the slide there, it says feedback. And those are ways in which people either can give you feedback in the sense of the public domain, which is what is known to you and known to others. Then there is the hidden domain, which is known to you but is not disclosed to others, or so you think. Because actually, as I'm saying, brains copy brains, as I call it. So this idea that we're not disclosing information about ourselves or feelings or emotions that we would like to think we're not disclosing is often a bit of a myth, an illusion. And on the top right, on the 2x2, you there see blind spots, which are the areas which we know about you, but you don't necessarily know about yourself. And that's obviously the predominant area that we're speaking about today, how to get feedback on blind spots in yourself. And then the fourth box, unknown to both, which may emerge through the C360 process, of course. So a little question for you all. How many of you have used 360 instruments with clients, and how many have you received 360 feedback on yourself? Alana, I'll hand over to you. You're going to take us through this little exercise.
Thanks, John. Yeah, no worries. So this is just a quick poll. So what I'm going to do, it's 2 questions, like John said. How many of you have used 360 feedback, and how many of you have received 360 feedback? Launching this now, everyone should have a little pop-up on their screen. All you need to do is just press yes or no. Looks like everyone's starting now, John.
Yes, I can see it. Miracle.
Yes. So it looks like we've had most people. A few more. Okay, that looks like most people have put in their info. So I'm going to share the results now with everyone. So that should be able to see that on your screen now. So John, can you see that?
I can. Yeah, so we've got 65% of people saying have used 360, and therefore 35 have not, and have received 360 feedback. 75% have, and 26%, or 74%, or 26% have not. So good, that's a good spread of people, and we will hopefully, those of you who haven't ever heard perhaps the 360 feedback, you'll have a better idea of it as a result of this webinar. Thanks, Alana. So if you could take that off the screen, or do I need to do that?
You'll need to do that, John. I can't just do that.
Yeah, fine. Okay, thanks very much. So, and welcome to people who've joined in the last 5 minutes. We've obviously started and taking through you all on these slides about an introduction to 360 feedback. We were just asking who'd used it. So now a little exercise for you to do, which is to think of times when you have received helpful, constructive feedback, and also when you've received less helpful feedback. So just for a very short time, just a minute, just jot down some thoughts. A time when you received helpful, constructive feedback. What about the feedback made it helpful and constructive? So what is it about feedback, the way it was delivered, that was helpful and constructive? And then a few moments on a time when you received some unhelpful feedback, and what was it about that that made it not so helpful? So we'll just pause for a moment to let you make a few notes just for yourselves. So just try and get a sense of what was the quality of the feedback that made it constructive, or alternatively, the quality of the feedback that made it not so helpful. What was it the other person was doing to make it constructive or not so helpful? Okay, well, we will now look at a slide which suggests what the difference between those two are and see whether you would agree with this. But on the left-hand side there, you can see elements of constructive feedback, that it be specific. It's about, in some detail, what the actual behavior was, what I like and why. Supportive, to give the sense that the criticism is meant to help the person do better. This is really very important, that when you're giving feedback, I'm just thinking now here of verbal feedback, one-to-one feedback, or perhaps in a group, is the phrase positive intent. If you are not giving feedback with positive intent, as I've said, brains copy brains, the other person's brain will recognize that your intent is not entirely positive. It may be just that you're anxious, it may be that you've got a negative feeling towards the person, it may be that you're nervous giving the feedback. But in one way or another, it's very likely that the other person's brain will get a sense of this, and the person will then become aware that there's something possibly to be wary of in this feedback. So giving feedback with positive intent is important. Does it suggest a solution to the problem? That's part of a constructive form of feedback. And is it timely and constructive, meaning at the time of the event, or close to the time of the event? Often performance appraisal and so forth happen once a year, which is frankly absurd in terms of human learning. The events will have been long ago in both people's cases quite often. And so giving feedback at the time when it's close to the experience, and giving a constructive example of what the person might do instead. These are all things that help in the process of constructive feedback. On the other side, unhelpful, you can see essentially the opposites of these. It's vague, and it's judgmental. That was a lousy job. That's not really feedback. It's a sort of feedback, I suppose, but it's essentially a venting of emotion. It blames the other person for the problem, so it blames the person rather than the idea that it's not the person, but it's the behavior that's at issue. It's threatening, makes the person feel attacked, or it's late and doesn't offer a positive version of events. So those are some of the differences between good and unhelpful feedback in a general sense, and also apply in a 360. So we are bad generally at giving and receiving feedback for a variety of reasons. One is fear of what will happen if you ask for some feedback, the fear of being disliked, of being disapproved of, and so on. Human animals are prone to get anxious and prone to be concerned about the judgment of others, and therefore we are sort of predisposed to assume the worst in some cases, many cases. And therefore one's inherently anxious about the idea of being, as it were, exposed, and we're reluctant to ask for feedback. Incidentally, here's a little method for getting some feedback for yourself, because there's nothing like practicing it on yourself before you start practicing it on your clients. Here's a very simple method. 2 things that I'm doing well, and 1 thing I could get better at. 2 things I'm doing well in some context, and 1 thing I could get better at. The reason I've phrased it in that particular way is to keep it in the positive domain. So whilst there are things that are positive, the thing to get better at is phrasing it in a positive tone, so that the person feels that you really would like this feedback. And your brain is likely to stay listening to the response. We generally have a fear of emotion and lack of control, so that is another aspect. So preparation is really essential when giving feedback. Making it up on the spur of the moment means that you're avoiding preparing, and very likely the feedback session won't go so well, because you're going to be anxious and will induce anxiety in the other person. It's confused with confrontation, so people expect somehow they're going to be confronted with something, and in a way that's understandable. It's hard work. I've said already, you need to prepare and plan for feedbacks. We don't want it done to us, so we don't give it to others. So we're reluctant, and often when 360 programs are run inside organizations, it's suggested that the junior people need it more than the seniors, which is really not very wise, because actually the firm and its success will depend on the behavior of the seniors far more than it will on the juniors. But there's a sense of fear among senior people, what will happen if we set up a 360 system, let's say across the company, for example. And finally, just to say, it's a skill that can be learned, and indeed sort of needs to be learned, because it's not natural behavior. Natural behavior is to have a fear of foreboding about it, and to give feedback in an overly emotional way, or in an anxious way at least, which is likely to be misperceived by the other person. So here we are. This is what we really feel about feedback. As it says in the cartoon on the right, somebody in the office is spreading rumors that I'm not a good boss. Find them and kill them. I don't know whether any of you have been on an assignment like that, but sometimes I've found that people at senior levels are really not interested in hearing the truth about themselves. So now, what are some problems with receiving feedback? Why this is not a simple matter, and why thinking and reflecting and preparing for it is essential. These are some characteristics of human beings. Again, those of you who've been on the Meyler Campbell program will have heard about the fundamental attribution error. And this is a term psychologists use for finding that we tend to attribute failure, that is myself, something goes wrong, I will tend to attribute the failure to the situation, blame it on the technology, if you like, in this situation, where others will attribute the cause of it to my character. John's a bit disorganized or something like that. So that is just the way human beings are. We tend to want to avoid blame and attribute it to the situation we're in. Others are likely more to look for the causality in the person. Neither are necessarily correct. It's not that. It's just to realize that we have, as human beings, a tendency to attribute in those ways. Second concept, the intent-impact gap. Myself, for example, will judge myself by my intentions, but you will judge me by the impact I've had on you. As I said at the beginning of this webinar, to those of you who've joined since then, you are not who you think you are the impact you have on others. And by definition, you cannot uncover that impact that you have on other people except by asking and discovering what the impact is. And that is who you are as far as the other person experiences you. So we judge others by our intentions, my intention in this example, where others will judge me by the impact I'm having on you, as I'm having on you right now. You're reaching various conclusions about me. I have absolutely no idea what those are. It's confused with competence and performance. So one of the reasons that feedback can be misused in organizations is as if it was a measure of somebody's competence. It's not. It's a measure of how they're perceived, to put it simply, how they're impacting others. This is not the same thing as their competence on their job, and it's therefore not equated either with their performance. Competence and performance are things that have to be judged in other ways, typically by a manager who judges a subordinate's competence and performance of the job. That is not the same thing as 360 feedback. People can often confuse those two. 360 feedback is feedback about your impact on other people, simple terms. I've already spoken about the final point here. Defensiveness is inevitable. Human beings will tend to protect themselves from uncertainty, not knowing something that causes anxiety, and the wish to control things by going into a state of denial or defensiveness. And of course, the truth does hurt sometimes. People are preoccupied often when they receive 360s by wanting to know who said what about me, or claiming somehow the results are not typical or accurate. These are very common defensive, almost inevitable moves when people receive, as it were, quotes, what they fear anyway to be bad news. In fact, 360s need to be constructed so there's lots of good news in them, as well as areas for improvement, as we say. As I've already said this, both giving and receiving feedback are skills we can get better at, and indeed need to get better at if we're going to do it in a professional manner, or indeed in a private life manner for that matter. So what are some conditions that we know about that is likely to lead to success in the 360 feedback? And here, as I've said earlier, I'm talking about 360 feedback from a variety of methods. It could be an interview method, which I'll take you through shortly. It could be an online 360 questionnaire method, which I'll be taking you through later on. It must be voluntary. The person must want to do this in some sense. Of course, it may be mandated in an organization, but in that case, it's important to hear about people's concerns so that hopefully they get into a sense that they actually are interested in receiving the feedback. It needs to be clear what the purpose of the feedback is. It's not an assessment procedure, it's for development purposes. Who the reviewers, these are the people who are rating the person who's receiving the feedback. The selection of those is important. I'll say a bit more about that later. Usually, at least in an organizational sense, it's useful to involve the person's boss, or if it's a chief executive chairman, or if it's a chairman, somebody else on the board, and HR, at least in the setting up process. And since change involves other people and people need to encourage any change that's going to happen in behavior, it's useful for some people in the organization to know about what the person is working on, in principle anyway. Obviously there are exceptions and some people want to keep it entirely confidential. But actually, in terms of you as coaches, then involving others in the setup and perhaps getting some headlines from the feedback, not from you, but from their client, and you can help them with how to do that, will be useful in getting a positive climate around the whole process. A feedback session with the client, with the coaching as part of that meeting is, I think, essential, again, for you as coaches. If we're going to do this, then it would be essential to have a session which was dedicated to providing the client with the 360 feedback. 360 feedback, when people read it, often misread because of the anxieties and preconceptions I've already mentioned. I don't tend to give people their 360 feedback until I'm actually with the person, or now online. I only give it to them when we're already speaking on a video. So that's because one wants to manage the reactions and see the reactions and understand the reactions of somebody, because there will be some things that people will be surprised about, at least, almost always. And to emphasize in the whole process, it's the start of a developmental process, it's the start of a conversation about something. This is not some absolute truth which can be used by the organization to assess somebody's merit. That's not what it is. It's about the impact somebody is having and the experience others are having, and that's a very different thing. So it's the start of a conversation about what to do next, rather than to get too bogged down in this as an assessment procedure, albeit human beings will tend to do that. So, in a way, to summarize some of what we've said so far, there are sort of, I said three, the three essentials, and then a sort of acronym at the end. Three essentials here. Focus on the future rather than the past, and feed forward, as it's sometimes called. In other words, the purpose of getting feedback is not to rehearse the past and why this happened and all the rest of it. It's about the impact you may have had on somebody at some point in the past. They're giving you this feedback. The point isn't to evaluate that so much, it's to say, well, what can I learn from this? And the phrase feed forward, as opposed to feedback, better in some ways, because it's about, and so what? What next? It's useful if it's very specific. So you need to improve your communication skills, a typical piece of not very helpful feedback, because the person doesn't know what that means, where that happened, and what the impact might be. All of those are very unhelpful ways or aspects of that phrase. You need to improve your communication skills. Or the famous one, you need to get more confident. Well, if the person knew how to get more confident, they would already have done so. Indeed, if they knew how to improve their communication skills, they would have already done so. And that may not be a big secret to them either, that they need to improve in these areas. The issue is not so much the actual feedback, although it needs to be, as I say here, framed in behavioral sense. So I think you tend to lose people when you look at the ground in the meeting at which we were both at. Can I give you some feedback? That's a helpful thing, and implicitly there it's implying actually looking at people, eye contact more is implied by that statement. So it's a behavioral statement of what good looks like. And I summarize this in this little acronym. What's the behavior? Looking at the floor. What's the impact? People lose interest. What good looks like is maintaining eye contact. Very simple example. Now, this, what good looks like, is surprisingly absent from a lot of material on feedback and 360 feedback. As I say, often the feedback is to some extent a surprise, but some of it not wholly unknown to the person. They just haven't known what to do about it. And really effective feedback has to have some description of what better would be, what would good look like. If you give feedback and you don't say, well, what would have been better for me, for example, then you're not really providing the most useful sort of feedback. So that simple acronym, BIG. What's the behavior, when and where? What was the impact on yourself or observed on others? And finally, what does good look like? So hopefully you're getting a flavor of 360s and the actual complexities of it. It's not just a simple exercise. It's not just saying what you feel to somebody. It's a different sort of contract in which you act with positive intent. You give an example of behavior, you give a description of the impact it's had on you or somebody else, and you give somebody some pointers, some tips on what would be a way of doing it next time, differently. In this slide, I've listed sorts of ways of getting feedback, and some of you will be familiar with, many of you probably, with personality questionnaires of one kind. There's the Myers-Briggs, most famous one, the FIRO, and there are, of course, strengths questionnaires as well that you've experienced or know about. These are, in fact, forms of feedback in the sense that, certainly in the case of ones with some statistical background, so the Myers-Briggs and the FIRO, are going to give you a sense of where you are on some spectrum, or in terms of types, in the case of the Myers-Briggs, where you are on a range of, on a spectrum of things. Introvert, extrovert, and so on and so forth. So that is a form of feedback, and although it's entirely proper that people say, I'm not sure that's exactly me when they receive the results of their questionnaire, these questionnaires are obviously just mechanical algorithms that produce results based on the answers somebody's given, and so that's the result that's automatically created. Now, it may be that it's actually inaccurate, or it may be accurate but unknown to the person that they are by comparison to others, some place on a spectrum of behavior. But it's also what I say to people is, so what you can imagine what you've done here is you've met somebody at an event of some kind and they've asked you 300 questions, highly unlikely in reality, but you've very kindly answered all these questions. And this is the person saying to you how you come across to them. So it may be not accurate to yourself, that is, I don't judge myself in this way, but it may very well be likely that others will judge you in this way. And as I've said now a number of times, how we impact others, that's what life is about. It's not about my concept of myself, it's about how I affect others. And these personality questionnaires can be framed in that way. This is how very likely somebody may view you. Even if you say, well, it's not really me, then there's a question of, well, how could you perhaps express yourself in a way that you feel is more true to you, more authentic to you? Then there's the obvious 360 questionnaires, which I'm going to introduce you to a bit later in this session. And shortly we'll be turning to the interview method, which I will be explaining. This is not requiring an online instrument. So here we are, the interview method of collecting 360. Which can be collected either by the coach or indeed by the client. It's a very simple framework, what I use sometimes in my coaching. Incidentally, in coaching, my view is that people really always should, 360 should be part of every coaching assignment, because the coach and the client sitting together in a room cannot possibly know how this person is perceived elsewhere. So I really encourage people to get some feedback. Sometimes, of course, organizations have already done this, and that's fine. They could bring their 360 feedback to the coaching sessions. So here's the interview method. For example, by telephone or face-to-face interview. And as I say, can be done by the coach, which is my preferred method because the client doing it has complications in terms of how honest people will be, but it could be adapted for a client to use it, or indeed for you to use it by yourself. So what is Fred, Mary doing well? And so on the telephone, having identified who you're going to call, I'll come back to that. You speak to somebody. 360 degrees means somebody who is either higher in the organization to this person, more senior, and that's get a couple of people at that level, or a couple of people at the same level as your client, so peer members of the organization, and then a couple of people who report to this person, and then either a few more there to make it up to about 8. My experience, and I think experience of many people, is that about 8 people is usually sufficient. You get saturation after that point. You don't tend to learn a lot more. 10, yes, but beyond 10, you're not necessarily going to learn a whole lot more, providing you've got a reasonable cross-section of people. And sometimes one might include clients as well, or possibly even acquaintances, friends, or even family of the person in certain circumstances, if you judge that to be useful. So what is Mary, Fred doing well? Listen to the response, jot it down. What does Mary, Fred need to get better at? Listen, jot it down. And any other suggestions for their development, and indeed anything else you want to mention that may be relevant to this exercise. This is preceded by a person themselves sending out an email saying, I'd like you to participate in this, and these are the questions my coach will ask you about. And then, as I say, you, the coach, write down what you hear in response to this, and put that together in a report. I'll give you an example of that in a moment. You can use more specific topics, like as listed here: communication skills, collaboration, ability to influence, handle conflict, developing other people, leading people, or indeed in self-development. Are they good at doing that? Or things they need to get better at, and or topics suggested by the client or the sponsor of the coaching, if that's relevant. So you can tailor it to a degree. I generally prefer to keep it to those 3 basic questions because that leaves it open-ended, perhaps follow up with a specific topic. And of course, if your client wants you to inquire about a specific area, it's important to them, then obviously you're free to do that. But I think the more structured it becomes, then there's a limitation sometimes of people feeling, well, they'll just answer the questions that you ask them rather than getting them to talk spontaneously, which I personally prefer. Obviously, the pros and cons. So herewith now an example. I need to share a different screen. So bear with me while I do the mechanics on this. So hopefully this is the right one. Yeah, so Alana, tell me if you can't see this. I hope everybody can see this. So here is sort of format I use, which you're welcome to borrow, is front page. This is somebody that it's a real case example, anonymized, of course. So this is just to illustrate the format of the report. So I've made those calls. I've listened to people speak as I described. First question, what is name? The person doing well. And so these are some of the phrases, is how I tend to do it. Just jot it down. If it's liable that the person would be identifiable because it's a particular phrase or would reveal somehow who it is, I change the wording. And indeed, there's nothing wrong with saying, well, this is what I heard. I think verbatim isn't necessarily more helpful because people can read all sorts of stuff into verbatim which aren't necessarily useful. The exercise is what you feel you have heard in your phone calls. So I feel comfortable adjusting the phraseology so to explain what I think I've heard people say that this person has done well. And here we've got some examples of that. Mobilizing resources, friendly to employees, employees stay because of him, he's open-minded, a good manager of people, visionary, knows the politics, good network, fair, professional. You get the idea. So there's a series of phrases that have come from the interviews. And some more here. So giving the positive first and not showing the negative. I generally actually have a page break at the end of the positive because people will, especially high need to achieve people, which often we're coaching people who are constantly concerned about their performance and wanting to get better. They will want to know the negative news first, but don't do it that way around. Give them the positive news first and get them to explore a bit how they feel and what interests them and what perhaps surprises them about some of this positive feedback that they've received. People will generally be touched and pleased to receive. So, and then we turn in the session, I'm imagining I've given this report to the coachee at this point, to the client. Where does name need to get better or change? Some examples again from those phone calls. Communication, he often thinks of something and acts on it without communicating with his team. He's very busy. I expect you recognize people like this. He doesn't agree with something, he should say so more openly. He's hard to read what he really thinks, not always informing us of what he's planning. Fairly conventional things that may remind you of the first early slide I showed you about derailers. These are sort of classic things that busy, high need to achieve people are like. And as I say, not being aware of the impact often of some of these behaviors. Because they know they're well-intentioned and they know perhaps they're interested in the people that work for them, but that doesn't mean to say the other people are aware of that. So, list here of various things. You can read them briefly as I scroll through it. You get the idea of things that this person could get better at. Usually a longer list, as you can see here. Again, probably about 8 to 10 people I was asking. And then suggestions for names development. Here are some suggestions. Positively intended suggestions, communicate more with the whole organization, take the lead in meetings more, focus more on the strategy, needs to delegate more, and so forth. So these will, to some extent, reiterate some of what's been said earlier, but some more behavioral-ish, at least, suggestions about what this person might get better at. So that's the essence of the report. I'll come back to the other slides, or the slides. Yeah, so that was the interview method and an example of it. As I say, cheap and cheerful, you can do it yourself. I will be offering at the end of this, if any of you want to train further on any of the instruments, and if you're new to giving 360 feedback, that might be something you want to do, then that's something I'm very happy to offer. So that was the interview method. So, sorry. We've done that one. So this is about how to run a session. It's to remind people that this is not objective in the sense of a sort of measuring device. When they receive their feedback, it's subjective. It's how people experience you, albeit perception is reality, as they say. So the subjective is what it is. We're talking about subjective experience of you, the person. It's about perception, not performance. It's a development tool, not an assessment device. It's about achieving excellence as well as remedying shortcomings. Go through the item, the results item by item. Positives first. I tend to just read them out, and although the person has a copy for themselves. This copy, by the way, is for them only. It's not something that I would share with anybody else. I wouldn't even encourage them necessarily to share it with anyone else. Better for them, as I'm going to say in a minute, to figure out from this 2 or 3 things that they're going to work on and go back and get some feedback on whether they've chosen the right things. Avoid them getting fixated on who said what and inquiring said what the point is really what the overall message is rather than specific items. And then with your client, identify themes and objectives that they think it would be useful to work on. And following the exercise, the client should go back and thank their contributors, and perhaps if they're feeling brave, share some of the outcomes in terms of 2 or 3 things that it's helped them to realize they want to work on. And even further than that, they can say, I'm going to check back with you informally in a couple of months' time for you to give me some feedback as to whether I've changed in the respect that this feedback said I should get better at. This is all building in the increased chance of a change in behavior, which is why I like to involve the organization in the setting up of it to some degree, getting a sense from boss or from HR in terms of how they think this could best be part of this person's development. And as I say, you can suggest to the person that they go back and say, well, I'm actually going to ask you to rate me right now. First time we've discussed this on this, improving my communication skills, for example, and getting clearer in what I say, to be more behavioral about it. Getting clearer in what I say, how am I now on a 1 to 10 scale? The person gives you an answer and say, well, I'm going to go around a number of people and look at the figures, and then I'm going to come back in maybe in a couple of months' time and ask you again to score me, if I may, to see if I've improved. And by the way, when you think I could improve in this way of being clearer, do feel free to give me that feedback, either in the moment if it's appropriate, or after the meeting if it's more appropriate to do it afterwards. So you're here encouraging a climate of feedback within an organization. And my experience is, having, as I say, worked with these instruments for 25 years now, it takes an organization at least 3-4 years before of annual 360s method using, I'm going to introduce you to shortly. It takes a while before an organization really gets familiar with this. But we know that organizations where feedback is regularly part of the culture are part of their success, and they indeed will say so. Both Goldman Sachs and McKinsey have been using 360 for, probably 30 years by now, and we're definitely at the forefront of this now, much more common, but not to say still true in all organizations. And we know from those organizations that they would say that this having a feedback culture, not just an annual event, but a sense in which feedback is common, as indeed in any high performance team. So whether it be a sports team or an arts team, an orchestra or a group of actors, these are all high performance because of a lot of feedback. That's how high performance happens. And often people don't grasp that that is the essence of high performance in many ways, getting feedback and getting suggestions as to what good looks like, and getting people to help you to be better. It's a kind of culture one wants to encourage in an organization if it wishes to be high performance. And having done that, you might do the exercise again in 6 months or towards the end of your coaching assignment to see whether there have been improvements or changes at the end of that. So hopefully that gives you a picture of this sort of do-it-yourself interview method of 360. We're going to have time for questions in a moment. Let me just move the slide on. And indeed, that moment has arrived. So you've probably had all kinds of thoughts as I've gone through this. I took you through from the beginning an introduction to 360, some of the ways in which human beings are concerned about giving and receiving feedback, why it is a skill. And then latterly, I've been taking you through a method that you could use yourselves for doing that. We're going to take a break fairly shortly, but there's time now for up to 10 minutes of Q&A. Alana, over to you.
Yes, perfect. John, I don't know, do you want to stop sharing your screen just so you can see? Yes. See me, see the questions come through. It might just be a little bit easier for you.
Right.
Perfect. So we have had some questions come through, which is great. First question was from Catherine. This was about 20 minutes into the session. Can you tell us more about the brain mirroring / copying and the myth of the unknown to self that you'd mentioned?
The myth of?
The brain mirroring you were talking about.
And then you said the myth of or something?
Of the unknown to self.
Unknown to self. Okay, in the Johari window. Yes. Fine. So the mirroring, that would take us into neurophysiology, but some of you will have heard of mirror neurons. I mean, it's still a developing area, and there's always a risk with using brain science to sort of support things when the state of brain science is early days still with brain science, and there's a lot of controversy in the field. But there's general acceptance and experimental evidence to show that, for example, when a monkey, because they've done these experiments on monkeys, when a monkey sees another monkey raise its arm, for example, the parts of the brain in the monkey that's doing the observing, the parts of the brain that would enable it to lift its arm, fire at the same time. So that's a very basic and simple form of mirroring that's happening in the brain. So it looks very likely, and there are subsequent research on human beings, putting them in MRI scanners and so forth, which would suggest that people are frequently, the way in which I should say we communicate is by our brain copying the brain of the other person. After all, how does communication take place? It isn't purely a cognitive process through understanding the words that comes into it, but there's an emotional process, what we might call empathy or even intuition, if you will. In terms of the unknown box, I don't know that I said it was a myth, and perhaps I misunderstood that, but there's logically an area in that 2x2 matrix where there are things I don't know about me and you don't know about me. They may cause my behavior in various ways and have implications, and it may be that when you collect the 360, you'll get a better sense of, here's something that actually Jon does, for example, which other people are affected by. So whatever it might be, being perhaps aggressive in tone or something like that, because you notice that in the sessions somehow, because their behavior will be reflected to some degree in the sessions. And that would be what I'd call an unknown unknown. That is, it's unknown to me and it's unknown to others, although they experience it. I hope that illustrates in simple terms what that box might have in it.
Perfect, thanks, Jon. So the next question was from Penny. So that if you feel that some of the feedback is not positive in intent, even though you are aiming for that, what do you do? What do you do? Do you include or change it for the client?
A very good question. Actually, it rarely happens, but it does happen. It does happen. I think I would be inclined, well, simplest thing is to leave it out. If you feel it's not going to be useful, remember, keep in mind what the purpose of this feedback is. It's not finding the absolute truth. That is not what we're doing. That's no such thing exists in this sense of feedback. If, the purpose of the feedback is for the person to get some feedback that helps them change their behavior in a constructive way. And something that gets in the way of that, feel free to leave out. You might log it in your own head and think, well, what's going on here? And something about what may have provoked this reaction in this person and so on and so forth. But one's trying to feedback themes as much as anything else, although exemplified, as I say, by those bullet points. But I would tend to leave it out. Or maybe, if you feel you could legitimately use it to frame it in a more positive sense, then feel free to do so. Obviously, you want to be careful you're not distorting the whole exercise. But the purpose of this exercise is for people to get a sense of how I'm perceived, how the impact I'm having, and that's the purpose of the exercise at the end of the day. I hope that answers that one.
Okay, so next one's from Deborah. She said, how do you decide whether to use interviews like this or a tool like the ones you're sharing after the break?
Yeah, I'll come back to that afterwards, but in essence, this method I've introduced you to is a simple and easy to use method. The online systems that I'm going to introduce you to later have defined items in it, so you get a much broader spread of behaviors. It isn't only what occurs to people, but it's designed in order to tap into a range of behaviors that are needed for, let's say, leadership or senior management, and generally accepted. There are 30 items in the questionnaire that we've designed, and they're designed, as I say, to create a spread of, or to tap into a spread of behaviors. That won't naturally happen through a telephone interview. So, and also if you're going to use it in an organizational sense and a number of people are going to do it, then having a more systematic, structured form is more useful.
Okay, so the next one's from Hein. He was just talking about the number of people that use some of the interviews. He found that he found that less is sometimes better, and preferably 3 per category or max 5, as it focuses their attention and his experience. So any thoughts on the number of items in the feedback categories?
So the 3 to 5 wasn't about people, it was about items, to call it that. Is that what it is?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I'll read it out properly. So if these come from 8 to 10 people, they must be sometimes idiosyncratic. I tend to focus on items which are reported by a number of people in clusters, preferably 3 per category, max 5, and it focuses their attention.
Yes, I agree. I agree with that in general. I think I never report really something that only one person has said. I tend to max out on it maybe, and if more than one person has said the same thing, I tend to include it, because I don't know the significance of including some things or other things. But clearly you can do it whatever way works best for you. And if you want to sort of do a bit more analysis and say, I think these are the themes that have emerged, feel free to do that. I prefer to let that happen in the conversation and for that to emerge in the coaching process, rather than to have done that in advance. But you know, these are all perfectly sensible variations.
Okay, so Richard, actually, he's got a question that links to what you just said. So at what point in the coaching program of, say, 6 sessions would you conduct a 360?
Yeah, so in the first session, I would promote the benefits of it and hopefully get agreement to do it, and then carry it out between the first and the second coaching session, because then it's going to be shaping what we're going to work on in the coaching, not in its entirety. There are going to be other things that a person perhaps doesn't want other people to know about or not relevant to know about, but it's going to shape, as it were, the public objectives of the coaching. And if you do it in the way I've said is useful, which is to also get a sense perhaps from HR and the person's manager as to whether if we work on these objectives, are those the right objectives to work on? Because what can happen on coaching is it can be very much a black box for the people who are, at the end of the day, here I'm assuming the organization is paying for it. It's quite a different matter if the person's paying it for themselves. But where the organization is paying for it, is paying it for an organizational benefit. And coaches can sit in a room together with their clients and work on things that are not the things that the organization thinks the person needs to work on. Nothing per se wrong with that, but it means you haven't worked on the things the organization considers to be important. And indeed the person themselves may not be aware of. So it's all part of situating coaching within an organizational context. That's the work I do. And so therefore getting buy-in into, these are the right objectives. All of this you should view as a conversation. At the end of the day, it's for this person to have more better, higher quality conversations with those who are his colleagues at the end of the day.
Okay, so the next one's from Audrey. It's a 2-part question, actually. So can you talk a little more about why you don't use the actual words from the reviewers and why you summarize them? Isn't there a risk of losing the nuance and putting your own interpretation on top?
Okay, so I didn't explain that well. I generally do put the words in as they are, as long as they don't identify the person who said them. It's only when they're liable to identify the person that said them, because they're idiosyncratic phrases or would be obvious that who said what. I think you're trying to, you've got to respect the confidence of the people who've been good enough to share these observations, in the sense that it's they're giving it to a trusted person and so forth. So that's all. No, I think generally, pretty much the correct phrases. I didn't explain that clearly. It was only where it might identify who the feedback's coming from.
Okay, and this question might actually be answered later on, but how do you charge a client for this interview-based 360?
How do I charge? Right. Well, it's usually the way I contract for doing coaching. I would contract it as part of the overall fee. So there would be a fee for 6 months coaching, 6 sessions, inclusive of a 360. Obviously, you can do it differently if you wish, but because I encourage people to do it, I generally set it up that way.
Okay, so it's a few more questions. So
Yep.
this is from William, in the what good looks like in the BIG, how important is that the good should be self-discovered by the client rather than told by the feedback giver?
Oh no, the idea is it's given by the feedback giver. So in my example there, the behavior I'm giving you feedback on, assuming you've agreed to get some feedback, and indeed all organizations that are highly successful, many, feedback is so part of the culture that after a meeting, say with a client or with another party of some kind, they do a wash-up from that meeting. They give feedback to each other, they examine how effective they were in the performance of that meeting, whatever its purpose. Mm-hmm. And just to remind you, that is what high performance looks like in any field of high performance activity, sports, the arts, whatever interests you. You know, those people have practiced a great deal before they do something, and had feedback on their practice, and B, they regularly do wash-ups. So it's not from the person themselves, it's from me, the feedbacker. So I noticed in the meeting, your eyes tend to drop to the ground when you're making a presentation. I think that will lose the interest of people. It will reduce the energy of your presentation. Why don't we practice, let's say, you giving the presentation again, or get some assistance from somebody who knows about presentations, so that you develop your skill at it. So the good of the G, comes from the person giving the feedback. Mm-hmm. Because it's saying, I've noticed this about you, and here is what good would look like from my perspective. It's only going to be from my perspective. But giving a person an idea of that, because so often feedback is just very general and vague, because the person themselves is some combination of not very skillful and or nervous about it. So they give the feedback and then run away, as it were.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question.
Yep.
So Alison, she asked for some recommendations of some good texts and resources, and I know that we're obviously going to send that out to everyone following the session. The next question was from Andrew. He said he noticed that in the sample feedback form, the positives were single summary phrases, but the next section, what could he do better, were largely specific, often verbatim quotations. Is there a reason for this?
Gosh, I'm not aware of that. I think, I would like to think, I believe that they were all approximately verbatims. It may be the case that get better at is more complex. And I might have encouraged people to phrase it in a way that implied what good would look like. So perhaps that might be the reason for that. I have to go back and look at it. But essentially they are what I was being told. But yes, I mean, good spot maybe in the sense that when we're talking about things to get better at, I'd be getting a little bit more detail, because more concrete, because obviously the work's going to focus to a degree on that. And maybe when people say there are positive things, they tend to be quite brief. They're simple, and they're simple partly because they're not inhibited probably in saying it. So that may make for it being shorter. But interesting. I shall have a look. Thank you.
No worries. Okay, well, it's 1 o'clock, so should we take a 5-minute break?
Cool. Yeah, let's do that. So break, back in 5 minutes, folks. See you then. Hopefully we've got most of the people back, and we shall continue. So as I said in the last part, I'm going to now introduce you to two online methods for collecting feedback. So let me just get rid of some of this. There we go. So I'm going to introduce you first of all to our own Stokes and Jolly 360 feedback questionnaire. So this is an online instrument. It's been designed, as I said earlier, to include items behaviorally defined in simple terms. Many 360 questionnaires are overly complex. for example, designed around the culture and values. Nothing wrong with that of an organization, but they tend to get a bit wordy if they do that. And we know the language around culture and values is often fairly vague. So really a 360 instrument, I would argue, really has to be behavioral. So everybody is likely at least to be scoring the item, reading the item, and therefore scoring the item in the same way. So it's a piece of behavior. I'll show you some examples in a minute when we run through it. So it's behaviorally based, and we've selected for items that we think are useful and relevant to senior managers and leaders in organizations. It's been given to over 500 senior managers and leaders now, so we've got norms that can compare any individual with those norms. It's got both a quantitative scored items section and a qualitative section where people are asked more general questions to describe the person that they're rating. It's used by Henley Business School on the Advanced Personal Leadership, which is a one-week residential program that I work on there. So I'm now going to show you an example of that. So hopefully you can all see that clearly. And so this is the report now. So online, raters, normally 8 to 10 people, 360 around the person, have been sent the items that you'll see shortly and have rated them on a scale in terms of the strength weakness of this particular item. And this is a copy of an actual report that the individual would get. As I say, I wouldn't give individuals their reports in advance, but given it as part of a coaching session. So this describes the sorts of people that are respondents, raters. There's yourself, your boss, your peers, your reports, and some others, so clients perhaps there. And then the rating scale runs from 1 to 5, with 0 in effect being don't know. It doesn't get averaged, of course. The others do get averaged into an overall score. This is a summary. So you can see here the sorts of items we've got. This person, we've divided it here in this summary in terms of strengths, areas for improvement, greatest variations between your self-evaluation and the reviewers, and the greatest underratings by you compared with your reviewers in the final section there. So here are some examples of skills, behavioral skills that were identified are in the questionnaire. So managing work-home life balance, this person was regarded as a strength by people. They gave him a 4.2, him or her. Is receptive and open to feedback, 4.1. Listens well, 4. These are the scores I'm reading out here. The norms are, as I've said, 500 plus senior managers and leaders in organizations comparison scores. So the person gets an idea of how they're scoring, and you can see pretty high scores here for passionate about their work, as indeed is true of the sample. And then there are some areas for improvement where the individual's been scored lower than the norm, able to generate enthusiasm, express his own emotions effectively, able to motivate people, able to deal with poor performers. This was a person who had become head of tourism in another country, whom I was working with in the Middle East, in fact, and they very typically were somebody who was very skillful at their trade, marketing and communications, but in a professional sense, but not necessarily in marketing or communicating themselves once they became a boss. So, you know, cobbler's children. What we're good at professionally is not necessarily what we're good at in our own everyday behavior applied to ourselves. So this is a classic example of this, where somebody actually was not so great, he wasn't so confident in some of those skills you can see there, motivating, expressing emotions and so forth effectively. Then the greatest evaluation between the self-score, so the person scores themselves, and they scored themselves pretty highly on a number of things, where they were rated, here's a stream example, express his own emotions effectively. He thought highly effective, they said 2.8, which is low. This illustrates, really, somebody asked earlier why one would choose to use one method or another. this kind of standardized instrument, is useful because it has a cross-section of behaviors that it's reasonable to assume managers and senior leaders should be competent at. Whereas if you're doing the telephone-based version, which I was explaining earlier, you're not necessarily going to tap into all the crucial elements. So an advantage of using this system is that it is tailored to cover the waterfront, as it were, in terms of leadership and senior manager behaviors. Moving on, these are the actual charts that the person sees. So here they can see, lets person know exactly what's expected of them. So person rated themselves as a 4, the reviewers 3.9, pretty close. The norm for our senior leadership group 3.9, again pretty close. Boss gives 4, but peers give a low score. Well, reports give not so bad a score, pretty good score in fact, approximately 4. Differences on these, by the way, that are of interest are greater than 0.2, generally 0.2, 0.3, you would say there's a difference of interest. So here there's clearly a difference of interest between the norm, the reviewers, average, and the peers. So something to be explored. It may be that the person hasn't developed close relationships yet with their peer group, but this sends a sort of alarm notice that something's awry there with relationship with peers. I haven't looked at this for a while, but I think the peers perhaps generally quite often give lower scores, or it varies. Anyway, we'll see a table which summarizes that shortly. So these are the items. Lets people know exactly what's expected of them, encourages new ideas and innovation, able to motivate people, works hard to build a group into a team, and so forth. There are 29 in all, and they're all here displayed so the person can see variations. Some more, gives helpful feedback, able to deal with poor performers, and so on. And some more. And some more, total of just under 30, 29 items in all. I found that it's reasonable to expect people to complete that. Sometimes you'll find feedback questionnaires with 60 items and very lengthy. You know, this should take somebody no more than about half an hour to complete. So there's the bar chart version of it. Next is the table, which shows all the scores. And here we can see that some of the peers are giving lower scores in some cases, not in all cases, higher in some. So interesting variations between the average, the boss, who again gives a wide range, able to motivate, boss says 2, reports say 3, so these are all relatively lower. Let's see if I can see anything else that's of particular interest. Here we've got the communicates effectively, the boss says low, 2, peers give 2.5, but reports give 4. So here's somebody, maybe a confidence issue with their reports. They're felt to be and spending time on communicating, but with boss and with peers, less so. So as you can see, we could delve into this more. We don't have time, but a pattern starts to emerge and some hypotheses start to emerge, which can be explored and tested out with the client. And again, this emphasizes the systematic nature of this device, this instrument, as opposed to the verbatim interview method I described earlier. So you can see here, those 29 items cover a wide range of behaviors, and you're going to get a systematic picture of how the person is viewed in a quantitative form. So there are then some qualitative questions. These are, what does this manager do which makes him an effective leader? People fill that out. You ask the person to fill them out themselves. And there's another one here. What development needs do you think the manager has for his present and future career? And a final one there. And there is the statement about who's actually completed this, so one's up to date. So I'll go back to the slides now. So that was to give you a picture of the actual sort of report that is generated by this online system. Back to the slides. So the feedback questionnaire described, and as I say, online, sent out to people by email. They're invited in the first place by your client. We then send out the question format of those items you've seen, rated, returned, and scored up, and provide a report out of that. And it's all automated and all fairly simple to do. And you can choose any number. I mean, again, I would say 8, 10, possibly 12 people. If it's a large organization, you could do more, but you tend to say get saturation after about 8 to 10 people. In other words, you get repetition of data. There can be cases where it's important to do larger numbers. So what about 360s and their advantages and disadvantages? So here are some risks. First of all, pseudo-objectivity. So a lot of organizations still treat them as if these were somehow some objective assessment of the person and their performance or competence. As I said earlier, 360s are not about performance or competence. They're about how somebody is perceived and the impact they're having. And it's useful to find out the impact, but it's not a measure of their competence at their job. It can get confused with that. And organizations can sort of lean on this as a sort of crutch. So, well, we've got now a nice numerical system for assessing people, so that's why we'll do assessments. These are not, truly speaking, assessments. They're assessment of something. They're assessment of the impact somebody has on others. But because there are numbers attached to it, human beings like numbers. They like certainty. They like simplicity. And so people can latch onto numbers. And that's a risk. It's the organization, if you're going to use this on a more widespread basis, say with a team of people. So with a team of people, you could do the method I mentioned earlier, telephone, but it would be quite time consuming and expensive, which is another advantage of an online system. Obviously much more economical. You've just got a price for one questionnaire, and that would cover everybody, much less than the time spent by a coach collecting feedback. And for a team might be useful because they can hopefully share some of the results together on standardized items. Items of specific actionable behaviors, I've already covered that, and that provides people with clear direction is better than an effective leader, and should not, as I've said, be used as a form of evaluation, but can feed into an objective setting for somebody, or indeed an appraisal. Can feed into it in terms of themes, not in terms of numbers, I would say. A person can be given the objective to improve their scores on some things, that's fine. But I think one has to respect the fact that these are subjective, they're perceptions, rather than some simple system of measuring people, which organizations like to be able to do. So that's that system. I'm now going to introduce you to the other instrument that I've designed, which I call At My Best. So this is a totally different type of instrument. This isn't at all an objective assessment device of any kind. It is a focus on strengths. Many of you will be familiar with various questionnaires that are used, Gallup and others, Strength Finder, where people self-rate themselves on things. The problem with self-rating is, of course, well, how do we know that's how other people experience you? So what I created was a 360 format, so we're getting strength as perceived by others, which strengths questionnaires, there are some, I think, that do that, but typically they're self-rated, which is not necessarily accurate. It's for a different purpose, for a conversation about strength. But this is an attempt to see how am I perceived by others when I'm at my best, and hence it's called At My Best. And the method for doing that, or I would say a bit more about it, it's a tool for exploration about the positive qualities, and it focuses totally on positive feedback. Reviewers are asked to describe occasions when a person has been at their best, making a contribution they have especially admired and valued, work, home, with friends or elsewhere. Together, these stories create a portrait of how the person is seen at their best. So what happens with this is your client would select, again, 6 to 8 people is a good number, but one way of framing this is the 6 to 8 most important people to you, And so that would likely include some family members. It would likely include people outside of work. I mean, no more, I would suggest, than 1/3 of the people should come from work, generally. But the other 2/3 should come from out of work, friends, acquaintances, family members, and indeed parents. Often people choose to ask their parents to do this, or teachers from the past, people that they admire and respect, and in whose eyes they would reasonably think they've seen me, if it's me, at my best. And this is to discover your, what we call best self, how you are when you're at your best. As you can see, totally different to the previous instruments. This is the email that the person receives. So I've selected some reviewers, possibly a parent, possibly some children, possibly my partner in life, some people at work, some friends, and they receive an email which asks the reviewer, as we call it, to reflect on 3 or 4 occasions when you've seen me at my best. These will be collated, this is in the bold here, provided to the person in a verbatim report which they will receive at a workshop. This will include your contribution together with your name, as well as the contributions and names of others. So this is just saying to the person, whatever you now write, it will be attributed to you by name. So it's not an anonymous report. But again, emphasizing only the client will see the report. It invites the person to write a short paragraph, or more if you wish, about when you've seen John at his best. So when he gave a speech as a best man, as a wedding ceremony, when he was leading the team to the top of the mountain, when he took us away on a work trip, whatever it might be, or when he presented to those difficult clients. It can be whatever, answering this question of when have you seen me, if I'm asking it for myself, at my best. So I would invite reviewers, they would agree to participate, they would receive an email inviting them to contribute, and they fill out online again 2, 3, 4 times when John has been at his best. So you can see it's a quite different sort of an instrument. So I'm now going to show you, first of all, a sample report, anonymized of course, and then a workbook which we provide for you to work through with your client in order to identify their best self characteristics in the view of others. So I shall just find those. Sorry, I've got to find it. There we go. Okay, somewhat misleading what it's called here. So this is a report, I'm hoping. Yes, it's a report. We call it stories. So these are stories that people have used to describe you. I'm just going to put it on a full screen view. So this is the cover, somebody called David Morgan, anonymized. They're at my best review. This is, I won't take you through this, I've described this all to you already. So again, I wouldn't give this, well, I might give this to the person actually beforehand. Certainly if I know them well, I might give them beforehand and get them to read through it, because when we meet for our next coaching session, we'll work through what to learn from this. So we've got here just 5 reviewers, 4 in fact, and a self-review. This is an abbreviated report, that's why there's a short number there. So here is Peter Smythe, who is a colleague of David Morgan's and has written about David Morgan. He's a client getter, a deal maker. One of David's strengths as a professional is to attract and deliver high quality work. Over the last year or so, he managed to attract 2 major M&A assignments. Interestingly, both assignments did not benefit his personal practice. He thus attracted work that allowed others in the firm to shine and benefit the firm as a whole. At the time, he continued to play an active role in keeping the client happy. So here we have good partnerial behavior being commended by his colleague, Peter Smythe. Another little example here, we'll go to story 3, empathy. About a year ago, I had a private issue which worried me a lot. He was always there when I wanted to talk to him, and we literally talked for hours. His listening ear, empathy, advice, and support means a lot to me in that difficult period. So this is 360 strengths, not strengths as rated by the person, but strengths as viewed by others. And reading these through, you may have had a chance to read story 2 while I was talking. They're quite moving, and it's generally a very moving experience for one, as you can imagine, if you did it on yourself. And sometimes people have given this, by the way, as a birthday present to somebody. So here's a present, and paid for you to have a at my best report. And so it's all done in a positive, entirely positive spirit. Somebody else, Irene Mangan, giving her 3 stories about David. What should we read here? Well, story 1. David succeeds to strike a healthy balance between his heavily loaded and often unpredictable work schedule and his ambition to uphold a happy family relationship. This implies efficient organisation skills, good time management flexibility, and negotiation ability. Annual summer and winter vacations have always been a celebration of quality time and family togetherness. Well, if you're David and you read that, that's pleasing to read. Touched, I'm sure, to read that. And another colleague who only wrote 1 story, but it's probably abbreviated, and Mary Morgan, same last name, and in fact is this gentleman's daughter. And she was invited to complete it, and she here talks about her dad at his best. She describes how every Saturday and Sunday my dad goes to the market, bakery, supermarket. It's his little weekend promenade. Every time when he comes back, he displays everything he bought for us. He points out the things he bought, especially for me or my mum or brother, because he knows that we like it. It's a little joke at home, the way he does the little display, but it's actually very natural, caring. It's this instinct of his that tells him he has to go hunt, go to the supermarket, and provide for his family. I really like it when he does that. So quite possibly, David, Mary's father, would never have learnt that except for this instrument. So it gives people an opportunity to say some very positive things about people that they're close to, the work sense or in a private world sense. So that is the report, and I'm now going to show you the workbook. So imagine you've perhaps sent this to the client, having briefed them obviously well in advance, day before, for them to read before the session, and then they come to the session and there is a workbook. And the workbook is this, which you would work on together with, just to the screen. So this workbook is provided for you to work with your client on the At My Best instrument. It covers a number of things. You get a person to first of all jot down some comments they felt when they read it. You might give this to them, by the way, the day before as well, or some of this. Some thoughts they've had reading it. Alternatively, what you can do is ask the person to come along to your office a bit early and give them the report, say an hour in advance of the session, have them read it through and to start working through the workbook. It then invites the person to identify some strengths that they've heard, 3 strengths that they've heard in your colleagues' report, family members' report. And to, I'm not going to take you through this in detail. As I say, if you're interested, I'm very happy to run a session for people who are interested in training on this. But the kind of things you're doing, asking the person to do, taking Mary Smith, the reviewer, a brief description of a story. So Mary Smith gave a story in which things were going badly and the client was complaining in an aggressive manner. Your contribution, my contribution, you remained enthusiastic, persistent, patient with us and empowered us. Theme of the story, under pressure, I'm resilient, patient, and trying to make the situation a win-win for both us and the client. So this is written by the client, the person about whom this report. They've jotted this down. You've got to imagine here when they've read through Mary Smith's first story. Brief description of story, contribution, what's the theme? Because this is going to be used, there's a lot of these obviously, and then these are used to really identify some overall patterns of the features of yourself at your best. Resilience. This is the person themselves writing it. I'm describing it as resilience because some examples: colleagues under pressure at a difficult time made them feel they could do it. When others were run down, I injected energy, empowered others to perform at their best. So this is the person themselves summarizing the features of themselves at their best under the heading of resilience, and so on and so forth, and usual sort of thing in a workbook. We're trying to narrow it down to some specific actions that would be using his or her best self more often. some specific actions which can then be coached, and what might block you. We talk about there, what might assist you, what might block you. So that gives you a general gist of that. Now back to the slides. So that, as I've been saying, is an entirely different sort of instrument. It's a person at their best, and is done from inviting people to write short stories, a paragraph story about somebody at their best. And as I've said, quite a positive experience reading that it is for people. And out of that, distill some themes for you to be at your best. And now a little bit about the different methods I've shown you and pros and cons of each. So there was the interview method that I introduced you to at the beginning. Its advantages are it's very open-ended. You're hearing directly, or the person will be hearing directly from individuals in terms of words they've used, strengths, things to get better at. It's simple in some ways, but it also is more costly in terms of time, because you're going to do, say, 8 interviews. They may take you, I reckon 15, 20 minutes is good enough for an interview, but nevertheless, you know, that's half a day of interviews, and then you've got to write a report and so forth. So it's more time consuming, has its advantages, verbatim from people, open-ended, involves the organization in it, and a chance therefore that they can go forward and support the person on some themes that they've worked on. Then there was the 360 instrument that I took you through. That has its advantage of a broad breadth, covering the waterfront in terms of the kinds of things a strong senior leader, manager should be good at. So we're making sure we're covering all the necessary behaviors, and we're seeing the difference numerically between how you rate yourself, boss, peers, direct reports, and perhaps clients as well. So a different set of data, and numerical, and also had a qualitative section to it. I think probably particularly suited, or especially suited to sort of middle management folks who may not have had this done before. Senior management folks probably have had something like this done before, and interview method may be more appropriate for them, but both are possible. Obviously the 360 obviously can be used across an organization. So you may be working with a team of people, in which case the questionnaire method may be better. So everybody's using the same data, got the same information about each other if they share it as a team or as a function within the organization. And then the third instrument I showed you, the At My Best instrument, is wholly different, as I'm sure you've by now seen. It's based on strengths. It's based on strengths as perceived by others, so it's different to a conventional strengths questionnaire, and is really quite an intimate, open exercise amongst people that are important to this person. So it's a different choice of people, and way beyond just work people, typically. So those are the 3 methods, and as I said, I'm very happy to, those of you interested, to get qualified in the 2 Stokes and Jolly instruments, the online questionnaire 360 or At My Best. I'll be running some sessions to take you through that if you want to use those, and then you're qualified to use those online, and we set it up and so forth for you. And then, so you'll get a copy of the slides, by the way, so there's my contact details. And here is some further reading. One of you asked about that. 3 books, one by Marcus Buckingham, who some of you may know, well known for his work on strengths, and an article in Harvard Business Review there about feedback. And then the Center for Creative Leadership, they were the people that produced the research I mentioned earlier on derailers, how to give feedback that works. It's available as a Kindle edition still. It's an old publication, but still, I think, one of the simplest and best on Amazon. And thanks for the feedback, a book written by the people at Harvard, Douglas Stone and Sheila Hine, or a more lengthy description of the science and art of receiving feedback. So some pointers there for further reading. And we've got good time now for question and answers. And over to you, Elana, to do that.
Thank you, John. So if anyone has any further questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We did have some questions that were from our previous Q&A, John, so I'll go straight back to those because I don't want to miss any. So the first one was from Meyler. How would you deal with someone who reluctantly agrees to a 360 feedback process, and when the results are shared claims to not agree with most of it, so not able/motivated to use it for his or her development?
Well, first of all, the setup is very important. Obviously, it's just an imaginary example, but of course, entirely possible, especially if it's been imposed on the person. And certainly if an organization is doing it as a sort of mandated exercise for everybody, then you're going to find various reactions to it. But the setup is important. In other words, the person should, as far as possible, see this as a positive exercise. They're going to get some benefit from it. Central point, if I've understood it, is really if they say, well, I don't agree with any of this, accept any of this. Well, it's back to where I started from, which is, but the fact that you view yourself like this is obviously different to how other people view you. And to take people to this point of realizing that you are the impact you have on others. This is I'm assuming it to be correct, and obviously that's controversial, but people have, I assume in good faith, scored you in this way. And therefore, this is the impact you are having. You may wish you had a different impact, but let's assume they're being truthful in saying this. This is the impact you're having. Then it may be, how do you feel about that? That is what they're saying. Their experience of you is. So it isn't some third party making this assessment. This is your colleagues. This is people you work with, giving you these scores. It's common enough, and I'm here to help you work on these things. And I understand it's quite upsetting, perhaps, or frustrating even, to see these scores. By the way, you often find this in organisations the first time they do this. Often there's a sort of pent up frustration with somebody, say a boss, who hasn't asked for feedback and hasn't been given any feedback, and so there's a sort of pent up amount of feedback that can be expressed through such an exercise, and you really sort of have to warn people that, especially those in senior roles, that you've courageously decided to hear what people now think of you, but if they've been working for a number of years, I'm afraid there will be some frustrations because nobody's perfect, and so you're going to have to anticipate there will be some negative feedback coming through. That's fine. It's better to know it. As I say to people, all we're discovering here is what people say about you in the coffee room anyway. So, the good news is this is finding out. This is what people are feeling about you, and there are ways to get better at it. It's a good question, and needs a longer answer in a way, but hopefully that gives you some thoughts.
Thanks, John. Okay, so the second question is from Gemma. She said, how do you help organisations make the cultural shift to enable a feedback culture? How to build trust and encourage people to not fear but embrace feedback so it can be ingrained in their way of working?
It is a process. It does take time. It takes a number of years to change a culture, and you need the head of the organisation, the chief executive, senior partner, whatever it is, to be totally up for this and to be subscribed to the benefits of this, because it's quite a significant statement to do this, and therefore it has to come from the top. If senior people aren't prepared to be involved, or it's just for junior people, then I would question the value to the organisation of it, because junior people's behaviour is in a sense shaped by the culture created by the people at the top. I think starting with the people at the top signals it in a good way, which is, maybe it starts with the senior team first of all, and with their immediate direct reports, and it's trialed, and senior team then go through it together and realise it's not an easy process. It's not easy to know how you're actually experienced by people. There'll be positives that you weren't aware of, but there'll also be negatives that you're not aware of. So it needs buy-in from the top, really. And if the head of the organisation is dubious or questioning of it, the risk is like any form of change. It won't be happen if it's not signalled and positively viewed by the people who are in charge. So that's critical to it. Setting it up in the right way, announcing it in terms of its benefits and uses for people, and the organisation has to be serious in terms of providing support to people, either from their direct line manager or perhaps a mentor in the organisation. That we're serious about this. We get it. We'll probably talk about people we admire who perform well, say in the sports or the arts, conveniently forgetting that they've done a lot of work on their behaviour, and they're constantly, in the case of people who are in the public domain, artists or sports people, they are continuously getting feedback. So we're just not used to getting feedback. We're going to get used to it. It's going to take us a while. It's going to be a slightly bumpy road, but better that we do this, because this is how we can collectively get a sense of how to improve our performance. Another thing to say about it is that out of, if say you're doing it with an organisation, then some themes will emerge out of this area in terms of positive ways they feel they're being managed and less positive ways they feel they're being managed. So it's quite a deep assessment, really, a loosely speaking term, of the culture of the organisation in terms of how people experience their managers. So it does take time. It's only worth doing if done properly.
Thanks, Jon. Gemma, I hope that answered your question well. Okay, so the next question is from Sarah. So she said, thanks, Jon, for a great session. Do you have any suggestions on how to encourage people to volunteer to be part of such an exercise if they're reluctant?
Yeah, again, don't often find that. Really only people who are, there may be some, somewhat sinister reason for it. In other words, they really don't believe in the confidentiality of it. They fear reprisals, and it has been known for people to abuse it and go back and say, well, people in my team have given me negative feedback. I need to know who those people are. Well, basically, you've selected a poor client at that point in time. You really should have spotted that that's going to happen, and introduce them to the thing and get them to agree that they're not going to misuse it in that way. So for people, your question is really how to encourage those people. Well, it's going to be confidential. It's going to be anonymized. It's going to whatever you say is going to be put together with other people. There's no way that what you say is going to be identifiable with you. It's going to be put together with others' feedback. And it's if you could do this, it would be really helpful, because person getting feedback 360 around themselves, it's really useful for people to know how they're perceived and experienced by others. So, there's some answers anyway to that question.
Okay, so the next question is from Jane. I believe that she's asking the norms of your online feedback form. How have they been normalised for gender and diversity?
Yes, good question. They are. I think it's. We don't have separate male and female norms, and that would be interesting and possibly useful to do. But we've not. There are about 60% men, 40% women. I can't tell you offhand the diversity of that. So a very good question, and point well made. That that we should look at the instrument in terms of diversity. So thank you for that.
Okay, so the next question is from Catherine. It's a bit long, so bear with me. I'm interested that you've restricted the raters to professional relationships. I've used tools that look at full 360, i.e. including personal relationships. This introduces powerful insights on strengths that may not be accessed in a work context and opens up a conversation about the whole person, including what they don't utilise at work. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree very much. Of course, the last one was very much, as I said, only a third of the people normally would come from work. I was going to say, and of course, all of these are done in an organizational context, and but people would normally be expecting to get feedback from their organization, and some people more scared, more reluctant to go beyond that. But you make a very good point. I agree totally. Certainly when I'm doing the interview method, I would generally encourage the person to nominate somebody from their out of work life, and indeed produces some very important discoveries. But that in a way is the whole point of the At My Best, which is indeed to get a rounded picture of somebody. So I can only support what you say. I agree. There's no reason why any of the instruments, the online questionnaire, could not also include outside of work people. So totally agree.
Mm. Okay, cool. The next question is from Hein. He said, so the boss score is individual and not anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
I assume this has to be agreed with the boss up front.
Agreed, yes. I agree with you, yes. To be agreed with the boss. So the boss needs to be informed that their score, unlike anybody else's, not the qualitative remarks, they're still anonymous, but the quantitative score will be evident to the recipient of the report, and they will get an email to that effect. And again, a lot of this is like coaching. It's about the contract, the setting up of it, creating the right conditions for it. That's where things go wrong, is when people aren't fully conversant with what is likely to happen, and care hasn't been taken in the setup. That's essential for doing this well.
Mm.
And incidentally, on the numbers, on the quantitative thing, we don't report back if less than 2. It has to be at least 2 people in each of the categories for us to report the quantitative scores. Otherwise, we remove them. So if there's, say, only 1 report, sake of argument, we just would say, well, it is in the data, but it's not going to be shown in the table. So there are ways of organising the feedback report, so it's more collected together. We can, for example, put just average of all reviewers, and therefore nobody is going to be identifiable.
Mm. Okay. The next question is from Julia. She says, how do you encourage the use of 360 feedback when organisations themselves have their own 360 feedback, normally once a year around appraisals, with the risk of feedback fatigue?
Totally. Well, then I wouldn't use the 360 Leadership and Senior Management Questionnaire, the second of the 3 I showed you. The first is so different than what the organisation has usually typically done, and hopefully it won't be the same time of year as the more standard method has been being used, in which case you may need to be sensitive to that. But the interview method is pretty easy for people. They're going to, have a 15-minute phone call, and that's all. And it's in the context of coaching, which is a different exercise. So I've not found often a problem with that. I think you do find it when people are going on a program at a business school, and the business school, as I've said at Henley, if people have had their organizational 360 recently, it does indeed have questionnaire fatigue, I think was your phrase, and one has to be sensitive to that, and you don't want to cause frustrations for people. So they could select a different sample of people. Might be one way around that.
Mm. Okay, so another question from Catherine. What are your thoughts on the importance of relational feedback? And as she said, I've been reading Lisa Lewis's book on this, and she builds a powerful case for focusing on the quality of our relationship with the coachee before considering feedback.
This is the coach giving the feedback from others. I'm assuming that. I mean, there could be 2 different things. Relational feedback, maybe reference to, I don't know the book, I'm afraid, but there is a school of, comes from psychoanalysis originally, or psychoanalytic psychotherapy, relational school of psychotherapy. And there are coaches that use that phrase now, so-called relational coaching, which focuses essentially on coaching people around relationship. And may even use the relationship in the room with the coach. Yeah, I mean, there needs to be a relationship of trust. we're straying into, perhaps more into / counselling, psychotherapy territory, and there's a boundary to be found there in how the work is done. I'm not saying I'm against it. I'm trained as a psychotherapist myself, but I think this exercise is more, I would say, around behaviours and the impact of your behaviour on others. The question is about the relationship between the coachee, client, and the coach, I believe. And yes, I mean, there would have been a full session, initial session, I mean, not just a chemistry session, but a proper coaching session. And if at the end of that you judge the time isn't right, the relationship isn't strong enough, there's a lack of trust, then one wouldn't launch into a 360 at that point. And that has happened sometimes, that I've felt the second session was necessary before I felt the person was really going to enter into it with a positive spirit and feel this was going to be a useful exercise. So absolutely, they have to trust you, but that's true of the whole coaching assignment, of course, not just for the 360.
Okay, so we had another question from Alison. She was asking about the 500 norm, and I believe we've already sort of covered that. David Webster, he just made a comment to say, one of the advantages about the interview method is that it helps to provide detail about the organisation and the context of the interaction between reviewee and client. We've had some nice comments to say that excellent session, they really like your approach. David had another question to say, are your products available on your website? And if I wanted to give At My Best to a client, what would I do?
Sure. Well, as I've said, those of you who want to go further with this, any of them in a way, if you wish, but certainly the two online instruments, I'm going to organise some sessions for people to sign up to. It would be an hour introduction to each of the various instruments and take you through them. And then once we've done that, and you've got an idea of the best way to set these things up, then you'd be free to use them. So they're not available. I mean, they do come via our website, of course, but they're not available to the general public until somebody's gone through a training. And we also recommend people sometimes try it for themselves, on themselves as well, because that gives you a feeling of what it feels like to get feedback. Did I answer the question? I think so.
I think so, yeah. Okay, so the next question was from Pam. First of all, she just said totally stimulating and informative session. So thanks, Pam. So can you say something more about strategies to avoid an organisation hijacking 360-degree feedback to one of assessing managerial competence assessment?
Yeah. Yes. So I'm going to assume that you're going to be setting this up, Pam, for example, for an organisation. They haven't got one already. If they've got one already and they're already using it in that way, that's a different problem. And then I guess it would be a question of working with HR and chief executive or whatever and saying, well, I need to explain to you what this instrument is and isn't. But if you're setting up yourself, then, I mean, there is as I've indicated, a tendency for management to want to have numerical scores on people and all the rest of it, and a sort of machine model of organizations and people tends to go in that direction. So there is a tendency to want to simplify it down to numbers. But I think all I can say is, take it step at a time. I think if the senior team in the organization aren't prepared to be the sort of guinea pigs for this, then you've got your information already that really it's not going to be a very sensible procedure for other people to do, because it needs to be led from the front by people who have experienced it and experienced its advantages and painful aspects at times, perhaps, so that they get the idea of what it's like. And I certainly wouldn't recommend somebody, say a manager, saying I'd like you to do it on X, unless you feel fairly confident that the data is going to be used in a, at the end of the day, scientifically accurate spirit, which is scientific accuracy. These are descriptions of somebody. They aren't an assessment of this person's competence. If that should be done in other ways. What you're finding here is usually people or organizations that find it difficult to do assessments in an effective way and are looking for a way out, in a way, of having those conversations. And it might be a coaching opportunity. I'm now starting to think that perhaps what the organization needs or that manager needs is some coaching on how to do effective appraisal sessions, which all human beings find difficult at all times. Nobody ever finds them entirely comfortable and easy, because you're inevitably pushing on things that are matters of sensitivity. So I would say the organisation, person needs a bit of help themselves on how best to do appraisals.
No, thanks, John. Okay, so we've had some nice comments just saying thank you for the session, really enjoyed it.
Great.
Naomi, she had a question. So again, she just said, enjoyed the session, thank you very much. Would you ever consider encouraging the feedback exercise to be attributable? I've done both types of exercise, and to be attributable, the team needs to be respectful and mature, but it can be powerful.
Indeed, it can indeed. Totally, that can be useful. I mean, you've got to be careful, got to know the people well, I would say, because you've got to be confident that it's hard to predict. Human beings' behaviour isn't that easy to predict, despite what people who design questionnaires and personality instruments like to claim. Human beings make choices, and they don't necessarily behave according to how they ought to behave, as it were, according to their personality type or whatever. It's just a misunderstanding of human beings. So you need to be confident that people are going to use this in a positive spirit, and probably you'd want to be present if it was a more sharing of feedback. To be safe, I would say do it in a team context and run a session where people can look at each other's feedback and so forth. So back to your question, really, which is, do you make it all public in a 360? I think yes, but be sure that it's going to work well before you take that risk. It certainly has advantages. And by the way, the follow-up, which I suggest with the 360, which is where the person goes back and thanks the contributors and said, here are two or three things I'm going to work on. That is as powerful as anything else. So people feel taken into people's confidence if a person who's their boss says, I get it, there's some things I've learned here and I need to get better at them. That's a pretty inspiring form of leadership.
Perfect. Well, I'm just looking at the time, and it's now 1:50. Well, actually now it's 2 o'clock. It's just moved over. Brilliant. So I think we'll end the Q&A there. So thank you to John for a great session. It was really useful. And thank you to all the attendees for joining us today. So today is actually the last Meyler Campbell webinar of the 2019-2020 calendar, but we will be taking a short break and back in September 2020. So if you want to stay updated for Meyler Campbell events, just make sure you're signed up to our communications list. We'll keep you updated. Before we go, and John, I hope you don't mind, can you just stop sharing your screen? What we've done in the last few webinars is we've asked everyone to turn their videos on so that we can just all see each other. Obviously, as we're muted, we won't be able to do a proper round of applause, but can we just ask everyone to give John a thumbs up and just say thank you, for a great session. So there you go, there's everyone, thank you.
There you all are. Very mysterious it was too, speaking to people I didn't know who they were. Anyway, I'm glad. It seems like you've enjoyed it. So do stay in touch, any questions or whatever. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks, John. So don't worry, guys, I'll be sending all the slides out afterwards in a follow-up email, so you can expect them all. And the webinar is being recorded. So thanks for joining, everyone, and we hope to see you soon.